Okay. Okay, so welcome to week 3. I can't believe we've already made it to week 3 so far. And like I said, today we're in the classroom. We're going to be learning about protein power. So last week we talked about sustaining carbohydrates. This week is the power of protein, and lots of things to talk about today. I spent hours and hours of research this weekend just trying to make sure I was up to date on as many things as I could and had as much information for you as possible. And I love digging into the studies and just trying to figure out the nitty-gritty of things. So hopefully I can distill it down to some reasonable information, and then we'll talk about a little bit more this week about how to put that into action. So we're going to talk about the importance of protein intake, the consequences of inadequate intake, and then nutrition for optimal protein intake, some ideas to get us started. So we know that protein is important to maintain or build our muscle mass. It's important for our GI health. So the cells that line our gastrointestinal tract require protein, primarily glutamine, to help feed them. It's important for our detoxification process. So we've talked a little bit on the fact of toxins can contribute to some Parkinson's symptoms and development. And our body needs protein to actually detoxify for our liver and things like that to go through phase 2 of detoxification. It's important for neurotransmitter synthesis. Dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters, but then there are other ones that we need to synthesize, such as serotonin and those types of things. And then protein is important for our immunity, and that's especially relevant right now for us as we're facing a worldwide pandemic, and we need protein to manufacture those immune cells in the body. So, in all my research, I wish I could say that I could come to one conclusion. Should we go vegan or should we go paleo? And there are people who are very vehement on either side of the equation. You should only be doing plants, or you really don't need many plant foods at all. Stay away from all the grains. You really need to be going paleo and doing a lot of meats and kind of a hunter-gatherer approach. So we'll talk a little bit more about where I land on this. And I have one very astounding conclusion, being a little sarcastic. Okay, so when I talk about protein, I'm going to be talking about natural and organic ways to get in our protein power. And that includes things like pasture-raised eggs, wild-caught game like venison, if you like that kind of thing and you have access to it, grass-fed beef and bison, wild-caught fish and soy, wild-caught fish and seafood, organic soy, and I have an asterisk beside soy because that's a very controversial one. Soy is one that I find to be highly inflammatory for many people when I do a food and food chemical sensitivity panel with people, and I find that a lot of my clients do not tolerate soy well. So on some side of the equation, the people who are going heavily plant-based rely upon soy protein often. But I would just say if you're going to have soy, then let's make it something like edamame or tofu, but not a lot of processed hydrolyzed soy. Make sure it's organic, and there's a lot of research. There's a study I referenced at the bottom about glyphosate, which is in Roundup, and its impact upon our modern diseases, even development, and that study development of Parkinson's and things like that, and how it can contribute to some of those disturbances of our gut microbiome and that type of thing. Grass-fed lamb is a great idea. Might be a little bit partial. My husband and I raise grass-fed lamb, and that's one idea. If you can find someone locally who distributes that, and that's something you enjoy. Free-range poultry, grass-fed dairy. And we're going to be digging a little bit more into dairy throughout the rest of this class today. Beans and legumes, and then nuts and seeds are also sources of protein. They aren't the highest biological availability. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the animal proteins are always going to be easy for your body to get the amino acids that they need from that. And the amino acids are like, if you think about Lego blocks, if your children or grandchildren ever built Lego, the little bitty blocks that fit together to make a bigger design. That's what amino acids are. And so proteins are made up of different combinations of an amino acid, and the vegetarian proteins or non-animal based proteins are not aren't completely complete. Doesn't give your body every single amino acid that we need. So we have to combine that with some other things. They can still be viable sources of protein. Just have to think about in the context of a day if you're getting the full spectrum of proteins that you need. So the things that we're going to be watching out for again are things like hydrolyzed whey or whey protein isolate. So these are proteins that have been stripped down and changed their format so much that they don't really look like the original source of protein that they came from. We see a lot of these types of hydrolyzed protein, isolate proteins in things like cereals that are talk about being high protein, or protein bars out there that aren't very natural. And I have some problems with some of those. A lot of them tend to be modified genetically, like the soy protein. So it's just very cheap, also a cheap source of protein for companies to put in their foods. And then they may affect the body in a different way. So when we'll talk about how to use some protein powders even throughout this presentation, and we'll be using some of that as we cook this upcoming week in our kitchen time. So other thing we're watching out for: conventionally farmed meats and poultries. And then farmed fish and seafood. Conventionally farmed meats and poultry would just be the meats that you would find at the store that are just coming off of the chicken farms, so they're just so crowded and they're using a lot of compounds that aren't going to be enhancing the health of the chicken. They can be eating a lot of genetically modified grains and foods that are going to affect the meat. And then we kind of think about the fact of magnification. So when an animal eats a plant that has been sprayed heavily with pesticides, genetically modified, and the animal eats so much of that, the residue is going to end up in the animal's body, and the effect really is more magnified than if you were just to eat a little bit of that food itself even. So that's why I'm a little bit more concerned. And if we have to decide based upon budget where we're going to spend the money, almost would rather let's invest money in good quality proteins first, and then you may be able to budget out when you want to buy organic produce or non-organic produce. So if we're having to make a choice based upon that kind of thing, I'd say invest in the good quality proteins first. And then you can even find local farmers who may not necessarily raise their meats or vegetables in an organic way, but once you talk to them, you realize they're very conservative about how they spray. But it's just very expensive to be certified as an organic farmer. So for instance, on my farm, we cannot sell our meat as organic meat, but I know what our animals have been grazing on, and that's something that we can control. Excuse me, I think I'm trying to let somebody else in. That's something that I can control. And so I'm a little bit more careful. I'm going to let another participant in right now, and oh, there we go. So again, I'm going to go back to the screen for a second. And then the farm fish and seafood. We have to be careful for some of these as well. And seafood in general is one that it's a little bit controversial. We'll talk some ways about how to incorporate seafood throughout our class today. But seafood can be very high sources of things like mercury and toxins. And we have to be careful about where we purchase our seafood and what kind of seafood it is. There are some brands that I do like, and seafood can be a good source of protein for you. It might be something that you would enjoy. It's going to have, some of them are going to have good fatty acids in there. And then it's also a softer protein, often and easier to eat. It can cook quickly, so there are some benefits to that. But I think in general, when we round out our protein intake so that we're getting things from a lot of different sources versus only eating one type of protein, it's just the same thing with vegetables. We kind of round it out, and it's going to be about the average versus just this one thing we do all the time. I think we're going to end up in a better, more well-rounded. It's going to turn out better for us. I can't say that very eloquently. Let's talk a little bit more about dairy, though, because this is one of the things that I see a lot in research that comes up when we're talking about Parkinson's disease. And going through the studies this past weekend, again, just looking at some of the things, and we've had some previous studies that said no dairy with Parkinson's, and then some of the more recent studies that I'm looking at that kind of analyze past studies, and looking at things like there's a nurses study that's an ongoing study, and some different data where they're looking at ongoing development of Parkinson's and things like that. We know that frequent consumption of skim and low-fat yogurt, as well as sherbet and frozen yogurt, appears to be associated with a modest increased risk of Parkinson's disease in women and in men. So some studies had just shown men previously, but it's mainly those lower fat products, which we don't know exactly why. But this study did control for smoking, body mass index, alcohol and caffeine intake, total energy intake, and activity. So I feel like this is a fairly reliable, it is a reliable study. And it's interesting to me because when I do, again, a food and food chemical sensitivity panel on my clients to determine what are the foods that are causing them the most inflammation and the least amount, inevitably milk is one of those compounds that shows up very often for my clients. Some of my clients find that dairy is very inflammatory for them, causes a lot of symptoms. And some find that dairy is really not that big of a driver. But I will say that we have to consider the fact that a cow, when we get dairy, it's such a mixed compound. So it's not that we're just drinking milk like it would be if we were just eating, let's say, spinach. But that milk has any antigen in there that the mama cow has eaten, like particularly corn and soy and wheat. So that a lot of my clients who have problems with corn, soy, or wheat and find that those cause them increased inflammation may also have challenges with conventional dairy, because a lot of those cows have just been fed diets that are heavy in the corn, soy, and wheat. So sometimes people even do a little bit better with a grass-fed yogurt, organic, pasture raised. There's some good brands of that out there. One of the ones that's most well known right now is Stonyfield Farms. There are a lot of organic grass-fed yogurts available, and even milks. And then we're going to talk about another of my favorite type of dairy products to use in a few minutes. One of the concerns with dairy is that it can decrease uric acid levels. And that might be one of the things that you get on your handout here. So dairy can decrease uric acid levels. Urate, which is a salt derived from uric acid, is a very potent antioxidant. And so it contributes to approximately 60% of the free radical scavenging activity in the human serum. So that's a very potent antioxidant. And if it decreases that, then that might be one of the things that's kind of contributing to some inflammation in the body, they're thinking. Particularly, uric acid levels may be protective of Parkinson's disease in men, and that's what the most recent studies have shown. So if that's something you want to dig into a little bit more, then you can. Casein and the lactalbumin and intact milk protein are some of the things that they were studying. Casein is one of the milk proteins. Whey would be the other predominant protein, and lactalbumin is one of the components of whey. But we also know that every time that milk is processed into a different product, it becomes a little bit chemically different. So that when milk becomes yogurt, it's a little bit of a different product than if it's just milk. So when they're talking about intact milk protein here, it makes me wonder, that would be milk that hasn't been processed any. It makes me wonder, okay, if it's different, if it is more like yogurt or turns into cheese, because some of the studies are just showing things like the low-fat milk, or then the like low-fat yogurt or sorbet, things like that. So I don't know. I think it really boils down to what is least inflammatory for you, and just monitoring and watching your symptoms when you do take in dairy. That's one of the things I help my clients like really tune into, listening to your body and how it does for you, because I don't think there's one right answer for everybody. But so just listen, if you feel like you're drinking a lot of dairy, let's look for some non-dairy options for calcium. So one thing people think, well, I'm getting older, I need to be doing a lot of dairy for my bones, for my calcium. And I would say that our bone health, which is a completely different topic we can talk about more in a different time, and I work with my clients who have osteoporosis, but calcium is not the only thing that we need for bone health. We need vitamin D, vitamin K2, we need to reduce inflammation, we need to work on B vitamins. But then there are other non-dairy options for calcium. And I have put a list of that in a table for you in our module 3 for the week. And I'll send out a link to that when we finish up with the class. But this includes things like leafy greens, sesame seeds or tahini, broccoli, oranges, and then even almonds are a great source of non-dairy calcium. And so I think next week when we do our fat module, we'll be learning how to make a really simple plant-based milk that you can use for baking and cooking. You can put it in your coffee. You can use it to make your smoothies. So I think not just focusing so much on using dairy for our calcium can help you get in some more nutrients and just kind of expand your palate a little bit. Plus you get some more antioxidants and things like that from your broccoli, the oranges, the leafy greens, you get fiber. And so there's more benefits than just calcium in those non-dairy sources. And then one of my favorite dairy sources, if someone can tolerate it well, is to use grass-fed whey that has not been heat treated. So this is sometimes called non-denatured whey. The magic behind this whey, which is found in a powder form, and I buy it from, it's been produced, it's just been dried, really basically milk that's been filtered and dried, not heat treated, from cows that have been pastured, often in New Zealand. And it's a very nice tasting protein powder. Has a little bit of a sweet taste to it even. There's some calcium in that one still. But that non-heat treated whey means it still maintains those immunoglobulins that are in the raw milk. So it's really difficult for us in Tennessee to get access to raw milk. We don't sell it at the grocery store, that kind of thing. But we do know that there are some immune components of raw milk that can help our body. One of the things whey also does is it demonstrates some antimicrobial properties, like it disturbs the biofilm, which can be like the envelope around pathogenic bacteria or undesirable bacteria. It can also chelate ferritin, which is iron storage hormone. If there's too much of that, which is kind of a complicated pathway I'm not going to get down right now, but it can be helpful in regulating the amount of ferritin available to the brain if we don't need that. And then also promotes the growth of beneficial bacteria and butyrate producing bacteria. So that helps our intestinal wall health. We feed the good bacteria that line and contribute to that mucosal layer in our intestine, which we need for not developing leaky gut and just for staying strong and healthy and letting bacteria pass through versus taking up residence. Also helps calm down our intestinal inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. So lots of benefits from the grass-fed whey. But one more thing that we know that it does, it can increase levels of glutathione, which is, I think I mentioned last week, glutathione is one of those granddaddy antioxidants. All of our antioxidants in our body kind of accumulate to help make glutathione. So like vitamin C and selenium and cysteine all help contribute to this one. And there's been a lot of studies even just anecdotal trials of using glutathione for Parkinson's disease. And the one thing that's the problem is that when you just give glutathione via IV, it doesn't last very long. So one, giving the body what we need to make glutathione, and two, just eating foods that contribute to an increase of that can be very helpful. So there's a study that I listed at the bottom that I'm really wanting to dig into more, but it was really late last night. But it studies about a cysteine-rich whey protein supplement, which is the grass-fed whey. It was by the brand name ImmunoCal. But it was showing in a study of people who had traumatic brain injury, TBIs, and how it could improve the cognitive and motor skills and some of the trying to remember what, the brain-derived neurotropic factor in these individuals. So they measured some things that happened before the brain injury and afterwards. These are individuals who are more prone to that, I think like soldiers and that type of thing. So I think it bears a little bit more exploration, and I would love to even do a study for Parkinson's disease and grass-fed whey. So got a little bit excited about that, but I just use this whey in smoothies. I use it to make snack bites. It's just a very pleasant taste. You can add it to some even, I'll talk about this in a minute, you can add it to some plant-based yogurt too. So very good source of protein for our body. Our body can absorb it very well. So got off a little bit more on that one than I thought I would, but I was just excited about the grass-fed whey and some of that research. We know that inadequate protein and calorie intake can be a problem. So our body will start to consume its own muscle mass. Our skeletal muscle, our vital organs, which can lead to muscle wasting and weakness. And what that means is that results in a lack of strength and stability, immunity, and ultimately independence. And that's one of your blanks here, that we need protein to help stay independent. Because when we lose that strength and muscle coordination, stability, we know that that can be one of those determining factors of independence. So I know that protein is one of the hardest things often for women to get in at any stage of life. We just don't tend to enjoy the meat as much as the men do. But as we get older, there are some challenges to that as well. And we're going to address those in just a few minutes. We also know that sarcopenia, or reduced muscle mass that comes with the aging process, can be combined with overweight and obesity. So someone may be overweight, but still have much reduced muscle mass. And this combination particularly will dramatically increase your risk of negative health outcomes, disabilities, falls, limited mobility. So that's one thing we just have to be so mindful of, is getting enough protein in and helping our body make sure that we're breaking that down well. Again, there are some challenges to optimal protein intake, and that's one of the things we've already kind of hinted at, but I would love to know if you're struggling with your Parkinson's disease medication administration timing, like your carbidopa, levodopa, if you're having trouble timing that with your protein, please let me know if we need to troubleshoot that a little bit more. I know that there's a lot of some interference with the bioavailability of your medication if you eat it along with food, take it along with food, and that type of thing. There's also lack of appetite and nausea. That can be stem from many different things, and if that's something that you're dealing with, we can go down that pathway a little bit more. There's chewing and swallowing difficulties, time constraints, and budget. So it does take sometimes a little bit more to prepare protein, or it can seem like it's one of those things of, oh, I've got to go cook some meat. And budget, like if we decide we're going to really prioritize a grass-fed, organic, pasture-raised protein, then it's a little bit more expensive. And just in general, protein is more expensive than carbohydrates are. And it's perceived to be something that's more of a barrier. So I'm realizing I could talk a whole lot about protein. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to calculate how much protein you need. And then I will say goodbye, and I'm going to continue to record a little bit more. You're welcome to stay on if you want to, but I know that we said that we would keep this at 30 minutes. So after we talk about how much protein we need, if you need to scoot on out, that's fine. I'm just going to continue to record so that you will have all the information that I've prepared for today. So we know that older adults are less responsive to the stimulus of protein intake upon their muscle mass. That means an adult of maybe 65 or 70 may eat the same amount of protein as someone who's 20 or 30, and that 20 or 30-year-old individual is going to, 20 or 30-year-old will respond more. Their body will make more muscle mass compared to that same amount of protein eaten by the older individual, and they may not make the same amount of muscle mass or maintain that. So because of that, we kind of have to override that protein threshold. So the recommended daily allowance for most individuals is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. And we'll talk about how to convert kilograms and pounds in a minute. But there's some studies that even suggest that 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram per day may be needed with older individuals to help them maintain muscle mass or even build that. So let's go ahead and I'm going to flip to our next slide. And then for you to calculate how much protein you need, we need at least a half a gram of protein per pound. But if we're going to get down into that like 1.2 to 2.0 over here, you can do a little bit more. But you're underneath your daily protein goal here on this handout sheet. Just to do a quick calculation for you, you can put your weight in pounds in the first blank and then divide that by 2.2, and that will tell you how many kilograms you are. That's just a quick conversion. And then I think the basic starting point, if you're going to really get nitty gritty, is to multiply your weight in kilograms by 1.1, and that will give you how many grams of protein per day. That would be bare minimum. If you feel like you're trying to build muscle mass or you're really struggling maintaining muscle mass, you may need to increase that a little bit more. So you might want to go up to that like 1.2, 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram. If you're significantly overweight and you think, goodness, 2.0 grams per kilogram, and then where I am now with my weight would be a whole lot, we may decide to adjust that based upon what your more ideal weight would be. So that's something that I kind of flesh out and practice with my clients, is how much protein do we really need? And I know that's a challenge. So we're balancing the fact that you may be having trouble dosing protein based upon your Parkinson's medication administration, along with the fact that you do need more protein if you're an older individual. And so that's a big challenge there, I think. And even just reading this last night, I think it's already hard enough for some people as it is to get in enough protein. But then when they're younger, and then you add a little bit higher requirements as we get older, and it's a challenge. So if you need help kind of working through that one, let me know. You can shoot me an email, or we can talk about it in your individual session. But we know that individuals process and absorb protein and medications differently. So one of the things to know is that you need to observe your symptoms to determine how your body responds to protein intake. So especially when it comes to Parkinson's disease medication, you may even find that you tolerate beef, okay, but you don't tolerate eggs or fish or dairy in conjunction with your Parkinson's disease medication. So you may just need to tune into your body a little bit more to see, am I having some more symptoms on the days when I'm eating something like eggs for breakfast versus when I have something that's a little bit lower protein? And if we need to troubleshoot that a little bit more, just let me know. I'll be happy to kind of work through that a little bit more with you. But from what I can read, and some of the dietitians who've gone way before me in practice have just said, just anecdotally from talking to my clients, some people just tolerate some things better than they do others. So it's just figuring out what works for your body with that. Let's see. From what I have read from a dietitian named Catherine Holden, who writes on nutritionyoucanlivewith.com. She's a dietitian who specialized in Parkinson's disease. She's now retired, but she leaves her blog up. She's not an integrative and functional dietitian, but she has a lot of good practical advice, and she is exploring some natural things with clients. But this is a comment she had made. I thought I would just break it down for a minute. If you're taking your levodopa with plenty of water or liquid 30 minutes before a meal, that's usually enough time for the levodopa to dissolve and to clear the stomach into the small intestine before your meal protein enters your stomach. Usually that's enough time. Also noted that most individuals, a 5 to 6 gram protein snack is not going to interfere with the levodopa administration, whereas if you have a meal of 20 plus grams protein, it usually will interfere with it a little bit more. So if you're having trouble with that dosing and administration, you have to kind of consider how much protein you're getting in. Not that you can't have any protein, because we've already talked about sustaining carbohydrates and pairing carbs with protein and fat. We do know, and we'll talk about this next week, that sometimes even fat can delay the effects of your levodopa if it's slowing down your intestinal transit time a little bit. So one of the challenges that we have with optimal protein digestion can be low stomach acid. And we know that with age comes a decrease in stomach acid, but also things like Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori infection can impact our stomach acid production and can decrease the amount of time, decrease our body's absorption and breakdown of those proteins. So that's one thing to be considered if you're just struggling with maintaining muscle mass and you have some of the other symptoms of Helicobacter pylori, like some burning underneath the rib cage or a lot of acid reflux, and then sometimes it's just silent. So when I do a stool test with my clients, we check for the presence of that shows up in the stool, and often address that with just natural means first and helping the body kind of heal up, and that can jumpstart some digestion. Inadequate chewing and swallowing. So sometimes if it's hard for you to chew, or if you have impaired dentition, you've lost some teeth, and it's just harder for you to chew that up, and that you're not going to digest your protein as well, because digestion begins in our mouth as we chew, and then our body knows to start secreting some of those enzymes, and if we're just not chewing enough, then it can be hard for the whole digestive cascade to occur. And then also inadequate pancreatic enzyme production, which I've already mentioned kind of goes along with H. pylori, but even just stress can decrease our body's pancreatic enzyme production, which is, that would be proteins that our body excretes through the pancreas to help break down our proteins to those smaller building blocks, those smaller Lego pieces, to help our body absorb them. So some of my clients are taking some additional pancreatic enzymes just to help their body out a little bit. I base this upon testing to see, do we need a little bit extra to help break things down? Because one of the things that happens if we're not breaking proteins down correctly, that means that we're not absorbing that protein to help build those neurotransmitters that we need. And it's not going to build our muscle mass. And so we also have food that sits around the stomach and kind of ferment. So that would be carbohydrates that aren't broken down, but that can feed bacterial overgrowth, and that can be a problem as well for people. But I'm going to talk about some of the ways to kind of get around that. This is gastroparesis is another condition that I came across, and I wanted to go ahead and just mention it in this class today because this is something that's going to impact our nutrition as well. And this can be a problem. That would be delayed gastric or stomach emptying, which is very common with Parkinson's disease. And the treatment for that typically is smaller, frequent meals. So 5 to 6 small meals a day versus just 3 meals and just some smaller snacks. So spacing things out. And individuals with gastroparesis may not tolerate fat and fiber as well, because fat and fiber help delay our stomach emptying into our small intestine and further on down. So it just kind of sits there. The food just kind of sits in the stomach instead of going down, and makes people still maintain a high sense of being full instead of ready for their next meal. But we do know that smoothies are more often well tolerated. Or smoothies or liquids, soups, things like that, because liquids are moving by way of gravity instead of using just stomach acid. So that might be a consideration. Having a small protein-packed smoothie with good nutrients in there may be a better option than just trying to eat a meal of like chicken and green beans and roasted carrots or something like that. If any of you are struggling with gastroparesis, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more as well, if we need to troubleshoot some of that. But one thing to consider if you are struggling with that gastroparesis is, one, to optimize your blood glucose, because we know that blood glucose levels that are imbalanced or type 2 diabetes is going to increase risk of gastroparesis and the complications that come with it. Also evaluating food and food chemical sensitivities. I've heard a lot of case reports of people who've dealt with delayed stomach emptying for a long time, decades, and it ends up that it can be some foods that are triggering that, or food chemicals that are triggering that in the body, and it's resolved. So gastroparesis can come from a few different means. Sometimes it's a more of an autoimmune type situation, and sometimes it's more of a mechanical or something else going on. So there's some different reasons and causes for it. You do need to evaluate bacterial overgrowth. That could be a problem as well. Some overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, or lower stomach acid, again, which is going to contribute to less pancreatic enzyme production. Things just aren't moving on like they need to be. Also need to rule out celiac disease. We talked about that in last lesson. Evaluate thyroid function, which can delay gastric motility if our thyroid's not functioning correctly. Evaluate vitamin D status, and then magnesium. Also, magnesium is needed for GI motility, moving things along the GI tract and that muscle contraction, kind of squeezing that happens to help move things along. So maybe this will be helpful for somebody there. But a little bit more on the chewing. We mentioned chewing can be one of the reasons that we're not absorbing our proteins as well. So one thing I would recommend, if you're struggling with that, or you're getting tired when you're chewing, is to use a food processor to chop up your meats. So you may cook meats, but then pulsing it quickly in the food processor is going to be easier than using a knife to cut up your food. And you can add a little bit of liquid to that, like a pan sauce or a wholesome gravy that you make with a little bit of the pan juices and a tiny bit of maybe arrowroot flour or tapioca flour. You can use salsa. You can use fruit purees, which are also nice, like a mango puree with chicken is very nice, or apple with pork, that type of thing. You can either add that on top of your meat or just add it in with the meat in the food processor if you want to. Using moist versus dry heat can be helpful as well. So the dry heat would be more like pan frying or baking when it's on a cookie sheet. So we would lean more toward the stewing or boiling, braising, pressure cooking. I really like using a pressure cooker to help soften up the meat. And when I use bigger cuts of grass-fed beef, I often go much beyond what I would find on the internet for how long do I need to cook this piece of grass-fed meat. Usually in the pressure cooker, I'm cooking it about 2 hours, which is a lot of time, but it really helps to break down some of those proteins ahead of time so that your body's not having to do that and your mouth is not having to chew that up. So I have children I'm working with who don't like to chew meat a lot. It's almost the same thing if you, with an older individual, if you find that it's also hard to chew like it was when you were a child, considering some of these methods may be helpful for you. I didn't put on there, but using the crock pot as well can be very helpful. Putting in your chicken breast or your pork loin or something like that earlier in the day and just letting it cook very low and slow. It helps break down some of those connective tissues in the meat, that type of thing. And then just choosing naturally softer proteins can be an option too. So that would be things like ground meats. Seafood is naturally softer. I do like a brand of tuna that's called Wild Planet. We know that it is, it's not farmed tuna, and it's, I think it's caught from a very sustainable source. So I can even send a label of that if any of you are interested in learning about it, but it's a blue label. They sell the cans and also the packets of it. So tuna makes a nice lunchtime snack treat. I don't eat seafood very much. I don't have a lot of tips and tricks on the seafood front. I do have some recipes I can share, but that's not one that I eat a lot, but I know that some people do, and that can be a good source of protein. I also look for wild caught salmon, Alaskan salmon. That's going to be a good source of your omega-3s, and it can be flaky and really easy to cook salmon. Usually you can buy it in little packets, and you just cook 1 or 2 of those, and it cooks in maybe 10 minutes. In the oven. So that's a quick thing to do. Eggs are also one of my favorite sources of softer proteins. It's very easy to boil eggs or to cook them on the stove, make it into an omelet. This week we're going to make some egg cups. I typically boil a dozen or more eggs in my Instant Pot every week, just so we have it on hand, and we have boiled eggs in the refrigerator that are good things to have for a snack. But eggs are one of the most bioavailable sources of protein, which means protein that your body can use very easily. It's complete protein, and they tend to be a little bit more affordable too than your grass-fed meats. So if you can find somebody locally who has eggs, that's another great thing. But also protein powders, organic protein powders, and I have a few of those on our Parkinsons list, but I'll send you out some of my favorite ones, including the grass-fed whey. the titles of those so you can look at that and use those. And I'll talk in a minute about how to incorporate those into your cooking and to your meal plans. And then bone broth too is another great option. Bone broth, typically if you make it or if you buy a really good high quality bone broth, that's going to have a few proteins in there that are helpful. But one of them is the gut healing compounds that we need, glutamine, which helps to feed our cells of our small intestine and our intestinal cells to keep our intestinal walls strong, helps aid with immunity. And 1 cup of bone broth has about 9 grams of protein in it. So that's a very nice thing to be able to use if you don't feel like eating anything, at least sipping on a cup of broth. And I'll include some recipes for you this week about how to make your own bone broth, either in the electric pressure cooker or in the crock pot, if you have that. If you're using grass-fed, pasture-raised cuts of meat and you have the bones and the skins of that, it's really a nice way to prevent food waste as well. So if you've used chicken breast with the bones in there, or if you cooked a whole chicken, saving those bones, and you don't have to cook it right away, but you can save those bones in the freezer till you're ready to make a bone broth. That's a great way to kind of harvest a 2-for-1. So you get the meat and then you also get to make some bone broth. I like to use still the grass-fed, organic, pasture-raised forms of the animals that we're going to be making bone broth out of, just so we don't release toxins and heavy metals from the bones themselves. Okay. And then just ways to boost your protein intake naturally. You can prepare your rice or quinoa or pasta with bone broth instead of with water. So that's just a very easy way to do that. If you have some liquid left over in the pot, just use it like a soup. But when I prepare my rice with it, it gives it a nice flavor, and that's a great way to boost that intake. I was going to say something else. Oh, just choosing pasta itself. And I didn't list this earlier, but there are a lot of plant-based pastas now that are like based on chickpea. So chickpea pasta that you can make, or green pea pasta, or black bean pasta that you can make instead of a wheat-based pasta. And some of the benefits of that, they still have carbohydrates in them. There's also a lot of protein. So in one serving of chickpea pasta, there's 25 grams of protein, which is not a complete protein, but if you make it with bone broth, you have a lot of protein there that you're going to be eating in that pasta versus just a higher carbohydrate intake from a pasta. Another thing you can do is to whisk an egg into your oatmeal or your hot cereal. So if you're already eating oatmeal in the morning, and you're just having maybe oatmeal and fruit, if you're cooking oatmeal in the microwave or on the stove top, when it's just about finished and it's just about ready to go, you can just crack an egg into there and quickly whisk it up, or you can use 2 eggs if you want to. It has a little bit of a custardy taste, but it really goes nicely with that oatmeal and hot cereal. So that's a good way for us to go ahead and incorporate more protein into something we would already be eating. You can stir in organic protein powders into soups. So if you make a soup and it's just a vegetable soup and you don't feel like making meat, you can just whisk in some protein powder at the end, or just individually into your bowl. There's some beef collagen powder I like, or beef bone broth protein that I've used before. So that way you're not having to cook the meat to go with the soup if you don't want to. Or if you're buying some prepackaged quality organic soups that are that work for you. There are a good number of brands out there available now that are much different from Campbell's. Let's say it's a tomato soup that you really like. You can whisk in some protein powder into that and make it more of a complete meal versus just eating the soup, which doesn't have a lot of protein in there. You can sip on protein-packed smoothies. That's one of the things we're going to make this week, and I'll tell you how to use some of that. If you don't drink the whole smoothie, you can freeze it into popsicles as well. That's a nice cool treat and tastes kind of fun. You can stir your grass-fed whey protein powder or collagen powder into plant-based yogurts. So you may not tolerate regular yogurt very well, but maybe you do okay with coconut yogurt. And we'll talk more about some of those things when we talk about cultures. But you can stir some extra protein powder into there. Or maybe you do like and you do tolerate yogurt well. You can buy the Greek yogurt, which is a little bit higher base protein anyway, and use that. You can mix organic protein powder into snack bites or bars. So sometimes I like to make oatmeal plus almond butter or peanut butter plus a little bit of honey into a snack bite, but you can also mix some organic protein powder into there. or just simply preparing a batch of boiled eggs for snacks. So having that available, or you can buy eggs that have already been boiled. There's a lot of, now there's a brand of grass-fed organic pasture-raised eggs that they boil for you and have available. I think you can also buy some liquid, like liquid egg that's been pasteurized. It's easier to use if you want to use that for something else as well, that's organic. So those are some options just to boost it naturally versus what I typically would have heard in the hospital when I was a clinical dietitian is, let's just add in a boost or an Ensure. That's a great way to get in protein. But a lot of those traditional protein boosting compounds are going to have a lot of corn syrup in there, or they're going to have a lot of denatured soy protein or that hydrolyzed whey protein. Besides the fact they just don't taste very good. Maybe some people like them. I just do not care for the taste of Boost and Ensure and things like that. They just kind of taste artificial. And I think there can be a lot of things that are can spike blood sugar a little bit more, and there's ingredients that really aren't natural for our body. So you can boost your protein intake naturally. You may have to be a little bit more creative. And then if you just want a really good high quality protein powder that has some flavor in there, has vitamins and minerals, let me know and I can send you a recommendation for that kind of thing as well. If there's just times where you think, I don't feel like doing much, I just need to be able to put a scoop of protein powder into something, shake it up and just drink it. There are some options for that. So I can help you out with that one if you'd like it. Okay, so this week I've already mentioned we're going to be doing some recipes. We'll do a strawberry power smoothie, a cauliflower taco skillet, which was one of my favorite new recipes that I've just developed, and then some egg muffin cups. So that's what we have on the docket for this week. Thank you for sticking around. It looks like all of you stayed around. So I'm sorry the class went a little bit more this week, but I hope this was helpful information. I'll have the recording up a little bit later on today or tomorrow. If you have questions about this, go ahead and just shoot me an email if you would, or you can send me a text if you have my phone number. And just communicate, hey, I had wondered more about this, or can we talk more about this in our question and answer time? I'll be happy to help you out. But I hope you all have a wonderful Monday. You get some sunshine because it's nice weather here in Middle Tennessee. And I'll see you on Wednesday in the kitchen.